For 75 years, 23 families never knew their fathers and grandfathers' final words from World War II. The letters have been written, sealed, and ready to send, but somehow never made it home. Until two construction workers in Chicago found a metal box that would change everything and give a 98-year-old veteran the chance to deliver a promise he thought he'd broken forever. The sledgehammer hit the basement wall of the old brownstone with a satisfying crash, sending chunks of brick and mortar flying across the demolition site. Mike Rodriguez paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, looking at the progress he and his work partner Tony Chun had made on their third day of tearing down the 1920s building that was being replaced by a modern apartment complex. Getting close to the foundation, Mike called to Tony, who was operating the small excavator outside. "Probably another day or two and we'll have this cleared." It was hot work, even in the cool October air of Chicago, and Mike was looking forward to the weekend. At 34, he'd been in construction for 12 years, long enough to know that every building had its stories, its hidden corners where previous owners had left traces of their lives. Usually, it was nothing more interesting than old newspapers used as insulation or forgotten tools left behind by long-dead craftsmen. But when Mike's sledgehammer broke through the final section of the basement's north wall, it revealed something unexpected, a small cavity in the foundation, barely 2 feet square, that looked like it had been deliberately created and sealed. "Tony," Mike called, setting down his hammer and pulling out his flashlight. "Come take a look at this." Tony shut off the excavator and walked over, brushing dust from his work gloves. At 29, he was the tech-savvy member of their two-man crew, the one who handled the digital documentation and permit paperwork that modern construction required. "What did you find?" Tony asked, peering into the hole Mike had created. Mike reached into the cavity and carefully extracted a metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, but much heavier. The metal was darkened with age, but appeared to be some kind of military-issue container, with hinges and a latch that had held firm despite decades of moisture and temperature changes. "Looks old," Tony said, running his fingers over the tarnished surface. "Really old. Check out this date stamp." Embossed on the lid, barely visible through the patina of age, were the numbers 1945 and what appeared to be military specifications. Mike and Tony exchanged glances. They'd been working construction long enough to know that finding things in old buildings was common. Coins, photographs, forgotten personal items that previous owners had lost or hidden. But this felt different. The deliberate placement, the military container, the careful sealing of the cavity all suggested that whatever was inside had been put there intentionally. "Should we open it?" Tony asked. Mike nodded. "If it's important, somebody's family might want it back." The latch opened with surprising ease, as if the box had been built to last. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth that had protected the contents from moisture for over 7 decades, were stacks of letters. Not just any letters. These were handwritten, carefully folded, and addressed in the formal style of the 1940s. Each envelope bore a return address for Staff Sergeant William Hayes, U.S. Army, and was addressed to Mrs. followed by various surnames and addresses across the United States. Mike carefully lifted the first letter from the stack. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. Dorothy Manning, 1247 Elm Street, Springfield, Ohio, and marked personal final effect. Mike opened the first envelope with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "Dear Mrs. Manning, it is with a heavy heart that I write to tell you about your son James, who served under my command in the 101st Airborne Division. James died a hero on June 6, 1944, during the D-Day landings at Normandy Beach. His last words were about you and how proud he was to be your son. He wanted you to know that he wasn't afraid and that he died fighting for the freedom he believed would make the world better for families like yours. James saved 3 men's lives that day before he was killed. Those men are alive today because of your son's courage. I wanted you to know that his sacrifice meant something and that he will never be forgotten by those of us who served with him. I have enclosed his personal effects as requested by military protocol. Please know that James spoke of you often and that his love for his family gave him strength during our darkest moments. With deepest sympathy and respect, Staff Sergeant William Hayes, U.S. Army. Mike's voice broke as he finished reading. Tony was staring at the box, which contained 22 more similar letters. These were never sent, Tony said quietly. These families, they never got these letters. Mike carefully examined the other envelopes. Each was addressed to a different family, each marked with the name of a fallen soldier, each sealed and ready for mailing, but somehow never delivered. Why would someone write these letters and then not send them? Mike asked. Tony was already pulling out his phone. Let's find out. If this William Hayes is still alive, maybe he can tell us what happened. The search took less than 10 minutes. Tony's facility with social media and public records databases quickly yielded results. William Bill Hayes, age 98, World War II veteran. He's alive, Tony said, showing Mike his phone screen. And he's less than an hour from here. Mike looked at the box of letters, then at Tony. We have to take these to him. What if he doesn't want to see them? What if there's a reason he never sent them? Mike carefully placed the first letter back in the box and closed the lid. Then we'll respect that. But these families, Tony, some of them might still be alive. Children who never knew what their father's last words were. Wives who never got closure. If there's any chance these letters could mean something to someone. We have to try, Tony finished. That afternoon, Mike and Tony found themselves in the lobby of Sunset Manor, a clean, well-maintained facility that specialized in care for elderly veterans. The administrator, Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez, had been surprised by their request, but agreed to facilitate a meeting with Bill Hayes after they had explained the situation. Mr. Hayes is one of our most alert residents, she explained as she led them down a corridor lined with photographs of the facility's veteran residents in their military uniforms. He has some memory issues, as you'd expect at his age, but his long-term recall is quite good. He doesn't get many visitors, so I think he'll appreciate the company. They found Bill Hayes sitting in a wheelchair by the window of the facility's common room, looking out at a small garden where other residents were enjoying the afternoon sun. At 98, he was friendlier than the young soldier whose photograph Mike had seen in the military records, but his eyes were alert and his bearings still carried traces of the authority he'd once wielded as a staff sergeant. Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Gonzalez said gently, you have some visitors. These gentlemen found something they think might belong to you. Bill looked up at Mike and Tony with the polite confusion of someone who wasn't expecting company. I'm sorry, do we know each other? Mike sat down in the chair across from Bill and carefully placed the metal box on the table between them. No, sir, we don't. My name is Mike Rodriguez, and this is Tony Chun. We're construction workers, and we found this box in a building we were demolishing in Chicago. It has your name on it. Bill's eyes fell on the box, and Mike watched as recognition slowly dawned across the old man's features. The polite confusion disappeared, replaced by something that looked like fear. Where did you find that? Bill asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sealed in a wall cavity in the basement of a brownstone on the south side, Tony explained. It looked like it had been there for decades. Bill stared at the box for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the arms of his wheelchair. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 7 decades of regret. I thought I'd never see that again. I hoped I'd never see it again. Mike opened the box and carefully removed one of the letters. Mr. Hayes, these are letters you wrote to families. Letters about their sons and husbands who died in the war. Why didn't you send them? Bill closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, tears were running down his cheeks. Because I couldn't face it, he said quietly. Because every time I tried to mail one of those letters, I saw their faces. The boys who died. I heard their voices. I felt the weight of being the one who lived when they didn't. He reached out with a shaking hand and touched the top letter. I wrote those letters in 1945, right after I got home. The Army gave me a list of families to contact, personal effects to return, final messages to deliver. I knew it was my duty, but every time I tried to walk to the post office, I couldn't do it. The guilt was too much. Mike leaned forward. Guilt about what, sir? There's guilt. Post-traumatic stress, they call it now. But back then, we just called it weakness. I was a staff sergeant. I was supposed to be strong. I was supposed to take care of my men. And 23 of them died under my command. Bill's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if talking about it after all these years was releasing pressure that had been building for decades. I knew those families deserved to hear from someone who'd been there, someone who could tell them their boys died as heroes. But I also knew that every letter I sent would be a reminder that I came home and their sons didn't. So I sealed them in that box, and I buried them in the basement of my boarding house, and I tried to forget about them. Tony glanced at Mike, then back at Bill. "Mr. Hayes, what if we told you that it's not too late? What if we could help you deliver those letters?" Bill looked up sharply. "After 75 years? Those families, most of them are probably gone. Some might be," Mike said gently, "but some might not. And even if the original recipients are gone, their children and grandchildren might want to know what you have to tell them about their fathers and grandfathers." Bill was quiet for a long time, staring at the box of letters. Finally, he looked up at Mike and Tony with an expression that mixed hope with fear. "You do that? You'd help an old man try to make up for 75 years of cowardice." "It wasn't cowardice, sir," Tony said firmly. "It was trauma, and it's never too late to honor the people we've lost." Days on a 3,000-mile road trip across America, visiting 23 families in 15 states. It would take 3 weeks, funded by a crowdfunding campaign that Tony organized after their story went viral on social media. And it would provide closure not just for the families who finally received their loved one's final words, but for a 98-year-old veteran who had been carrying the weight of unfinished business for most of his life. The first stop was Springfield, Ohio, to find the family of Private James Manning. Dorothy Manning Patterson was 72 years old and had been 5 when her father was killed in World War II. She'd grown up with only a handful of stories about him, a few photographs, and the standard Army notification letter that had told her family that Private Manning had died in service to his country. When Mike, Tony, and Bill arrived at her door with James Manning's final letter and personal effects, Dorothy invited them in her living room and listened as Bill read aloud the words her father had dictated to his commanding officer on the beach at Normandy. "He talked about me?" Dorothy asked, tears streaming down her face. "He said my name?" "He talked about you all the time," Bill replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "He carried your picture in his helmet. He used to show it to the other men and tell them about his little girl who was going to grow up in a free world because of what we were fighting for." Dorothy held her father's dog tags, returned to her 75 years after his death, and wept for the man she'd never really known but had loved her entire life. He wasn't afraid, because he was fighting for something bigger than himself. The scene was repeated 22 more times across the country. In Denver, they met the grandson of Sergeant Michael O'Brien, who learned that his grandfather had volunteered for the dangerous mission that killed him in order to save his squad. In Atlanta, they found the daughter of Corporal David Johnson, who discovered that her father had died trying to rescue wounded soldiers from a burning tank. Each stop brought tears, gratitude, and a sense of completion that had been missing from these families' lives for 3/4 of a century. But perhaps more importantly, each delivery seemed to lift a burden from Bill Hayes that had been weighing him down since 1945. "I thought I was being selfish by not sending these letters," Bill confided to Mike during one of their long drives between cities. "I thought I was protecting myself from having to face the families of the men who died. But really, I was being selfish by keeping their stories to myself." The last letter was delivered in Seattle to the family of Lieutenant Robert Shunn. No relation to Tony, but a coincidence that seemed to underscore the interconnectedness of their mission. Chen's great-niece, a woman in her 40s who had become the family historian, received not just her great-uncle's final letter, but also his Bronze Star Medal, which had never been properly awarded to the family. "He was just a name on our family tree," she said, holding the medal with reverence. "Now he's a person. Now we know what kind of man he was." Bill had been transformed by the experience, not cured of his trauma, but freed from the weight of unfinished business that had haunted him for 75 years. "I thought I'd failed those boys by surviving when they didn't," Bill said during the interview that Tony recorded to document their journey. "But I finally understand that the way to honor them wasn't to carry guilt. It was to make sure their stories were told and their sacrifices were remembered." The video of their journey, edited by Tony and posted online, was viewed millions of times and inspired similar efforts across the country. Veterans organizations began programs to help aging veterans complete unfinished business from their service. Families began searching for lost relatives and missing pieces of their military history. But perhaps the most important outcome was simpler. 23 families finally received the words they'd been waiting 75 years to hear, and one old soldier finally delivered the promise he'd thought he'd broken. Bill Hayes lived for 2 more years after their journey, passing away peacefully at Sunset Manor at the age of 100. His funeral was attended by members of all 23 families whose letters he'd finally delivered, along with Mike and Tony, who had become his close friends during the adventure that defined the end of his life. At the service, Dorothy Manning Patterson Hayes spent 75 years thinking he'd failed his men, she said. But what he actually did was give us the greatest gift imaginable. The knowledge that our fathers and grandfathers died as heroes, thinking of us, and that their sacrifice was witnessed and remembered by someone who cared enough to carry their stories for 7 decades until he could finally bring them home. Mike and Tony returned to construction work, but they never forgot the lesson they'd learned from finding that metal box. That sometimes the most important things in life are the promises we think we've broken, and that it's never too late to honor the people we've lost by making sure their stories are told. The brownstone they'd been demolishing was replaced by a modern apartment building. But the developer, inspired by their story, included a small memorial garden with a plaque that read, "In memory of the 23 heroes whose final words found their way home, and the veteran who never stopped carrying them." Because that's what heroes do. They carry each other, in life and in death, until every promise is kept and every story is told. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to help them complete that mission 1 letter at a time.